Bill Phillips, thanks for coming back to Capitol tonight. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to see you. So let's talk. There's a number of issues that are impacting charters, as there are always.
Yeah, right.
Some new ones. The first is that charters actually performed better on average than your traditional public school, because charters are public schools. Let's get that established. When it comes to the graduation rates that were just released by SED.
Sure. What you're starting to see now is that the charter schools, they're growing. They've, over the last 4 years, they've actually grown 23 points. So what they're starting to do is they're doing better than their host districts dramatically. And actually now they're approaching the state average. They're a couple points off the state average. Remember, we always like to compare to the state average because I think we tell a kid in Brooklyn, you know what, you're always going to have to compete with a kid from Scarsdale, so get used to it now.
Right, which is probably a little bit scary. I mean,
they're doing all right, right? They're catching up.
Your detractors of the charter school movement would argue, well, the reason that you have a higher graduation rate or higher test scores or higher anything is because you get to cherry pick students.
Sure. Well, in that data, there was something very telling. When you start to look at disadvantaged populations, children of color, kids with economic poverty, special needs, English language learners, what you saw is the charter schools actually outperforming the state average with disadvantaged populations for every category but the English language learners, and they're actually pretty close on the English language learners.
Well, in the overall data, though, there's still a pretty big disparity between those kids that you're talking about, right? Yep. The high needs kids, the poverty kids who live in poor situations, high needs districts, et cetera, kids of color. So how much better are you doing on average then with that population?
Yeah, in terms of compared to the state, what you're doing, you're a couple points better than the state, and you're usually anywhere from 10 to 20 points better than the district where the kids came from. You know, the thing is, as you mentioned, I think this cuts right at the main criticism of charters, where they argue that we don't serve the neediest kids. Frankly, we're doing better with the neediest kids. It makes no sense that we wouldn't want to serve them.
So what is it then? I mean, what is it that charters are doing that is enabling them to perform at this level? And I also want to know this question, which is, you know, what is it that you're free of as a charter that the public schools are not? Because they would argue you have more freedom. You're siphoning off tax dollars in the opinion of the traditional public school, and yet you don't have to hold yourselves to the same rules that they do, which gives you more latitude.
Yeah, we got to work on siphoning. I believe what happens is the money follows the child,
yes,
right?
I know. I'm just using the language of your critics, so forgive me.
Yes, you are, very accurately. I agree. So look, there's no secret sauce here. What you have is when you have a school that's given some flexibility, right, and they trade that for accountability. The school can be closed if it doesn't perform. You put some talented people and you give them flexibility, and all of a sudden what you have is something that's operationally better. That, you know, so remember, not all our schools meet that challenge, but what you've done is you free up people who are talented to do good work, and the ones who don't get it done lose their charter.
Does that mean to you that, I mean, some of the charter schools are unionized, so it's the secret is not necessarily kick unions out of the picture and then you'll succeed with kids? Yeah,
about 15% of the charters are unionized. So yeah, right, it isn't necessarily a union piece, but you had asked me earlier what, you know, what exactly is it, the flexibility. So look, there are workplace flexibilities. The majority of the charters are not dealing with a 200-page contract.
Right.
They have to take the same tests, but they do have some curricular freedom, which allows them to change very, very quickly if something's not working. I happen to agree with my colleagues that the districts ought to have a lot of the same freedom and flexibility. That's politically fraught, and they don't seem that interested in fighting hard for it.
Right. Even within the confines of Common Core, the flexibility that charters enjoy within that curriculum and that controversy there.
Yeah, well, remember, Common Core are standards. So then what you do is you align your curriculum to those standards.
Right.
The charters, we do have some flexibility there, but also because you're dealing with accountability, you know, you've got to change quickly because you've got somebody checking up on you every 5 years.
So right. So you mentioned that if you're not performing as a charter, then subsequently you get closed. There is a case in the Capital Region of a charter that's fighting very hard against closure. SUNY wants to shut them down. It's Ark, right? They're in Troy, and they were in court yesterday, I believe, and they're appealing a decision, to shut them down based on low test scores. First of all, I know that you've been following this and you have some opinions about it, but also are you worried that whatever happens here is going to set a precedent writ large for all charters across the state?
I'm actually not, well, the precedent I'm worried about And I want to put some context to this, but the precedent I'm worried about is right now the authorizers are not particularly clear over what they will close a school for, and they just absolutely need to tighten that up. And I'll come back to that in a second. I want to give you a little bit of context in that we've been working with all the authorizers for 10 years. We have supported the vast majority of their closure decisions. I can only think of 3 in 10 years where we've disagreed with them. This happens to be one of them. So the reason we think the Ark is right on this case, they have sued for 2 reasons. One, they think SUNY's decision was arbitrary, and essentially what they're suing for is the right to basically appeal an arbitrary decision. We could not agree with them more on that. They've also argued that there's a conflict case, and that the executive director of SUNY, not SUNY, but of the charter schools CSI has a conflict. We don't agree with that case. It's not a conflict. There's plenty of kids to go around.
It just seems, though, that, I mean, what they are arguing are sort of in a rudimentary fashion is that the rules got changed in the middle of the game. And it seems to me, as you said at the beginning of that answer there, that there's no sort of clear reason why, a list that every year the charters could go over. Am I meeting this standard? Am I meeting this standard? I'm not meeting the standard. I might be closed, right? It's not. There's no clarity there.
What's happened in this case is SUNY has made a decision that the school should be closed based on the recommendation from CSI. I would argue what they did is they looked at the baseline common core test scores and said this school's going to struggle. The problem is that the rest of the data they need to back it up it doesn't support their case. And what they did do is they used some of the test measures in the interim, and frankly they changed it mid-cycle, and what it does is it tends to make the school look worse than it is.
You also have a situation now in the news, and we just last night, or 2 nights ago rather, spoke to Campbell Brown, former CNN anchor who's now an education reform advocate. You're going to see a lawsuit challenging teacher tenure in New York. Now, charter teachers are not necessarily, unless they negotiated in a contract,
that's exactly right.
Are not beholden to these requirements in last in, first out, etc. Yet, this is something that you are keeping an eye on. Why, if it doesn't really pertain to you guys?
Well, in terms of I don't know the intricacies of the California case versus the New York case. And you're right, most of the charter schools, the way it works is that the teachers always have a choice whether or not to unionize. If they choose, then they can negotiate tenure, and that's their business. This tenure case is actually interesting. I frankly wish when we were doing all this reform work that we had actually tackled tenure before we went after the teacher evaluation issue, because I actually think even something like renewable tenure would be more useful.
But teacher evaluations do apply to charter school teachers, do they not?
No, actually they do not apply unless. So we have to be really careful on this. So when a charter applicant applies for a charter, in the charter application they have to explain how they're going to evaluate their teachers. They are not obligated to use the state mandated evaluation unless they have taken the race to the top money. Some of our schools did, actually very few, did take the money. They would prefer to do the teacher evaluation that they negotiate in their charter contract.
So, okay, we're almost out of time. I do want to ask you this though. Is there a place at the table when we have this discussion, this sort of ideological discussion about teacher tenure? Is a place for charters at the table? Should you be included in this discussion?
I would actually think not, and I'll tell you why. Remember, fundamental to chartering is if the school doesn't perform, and we're obviously having a little bit of argument about how to measure that, but if the school doesn't perform, the school gets closed, everybody loses their job. Tenure is irrelevant at that point. Their argument here is that if the way for them to improve district education is you have to deal with teacher tenure. For us, we look at the school as a whole. I frankly would rather have everybody pulling in the same direction on a school, and if you don't get it right, then you understand that your job is at risk. I think that's a much more productive way to go at this.
Well, we're certainly not done talking about teacher performance evaluations, I don't think, because we've only hit the pause button for 2 years, and I know that there'll be more discussions, and there'll be more discussions about Ark. So I appreciate you coming in to chat with us about both of those things.
Anytime, thanks.
Thank you.